The Halli Casser-Jayne Show airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. The podcast's always available online at hallicasserjayne.com.
Oh, my God. Oh, come on. Oh. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. When they called my name, I had this feeling I could hear half of America going, oh, no. Oh, come on, why? Her. Again, you know? But whatever.
Not whatever. Wow. Wow, what a talent. Wow, what a career. Meryl Streep, one of a kind. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we explore the extraordinary Miss Meryl Streep with Michael Schulman, the author of a beautifully written new biography, Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep. And we take a look with author Barbara Leaming at the short but important life of Kit Kennedy, the subject of her new best-selling biography, Kit Kennedy, The Charmed Life and Tragic Death of the Favorite Kennedy Daughter. We'll be back with my guests in a minute, but first, welcome. I am your host, Halli Casser-Jayne. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you today by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by visiting my website at hallicasserjayne.com and clicking on the Audible.com icon for your free book. Hey, what's more fun than a free book? And while you're there, explore our ads and support the show with a click on the links. We want to welcome our new partner, our favorite store, the finest in offering gourmet foods, Dean and DeLuca. And remember, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at hallicasserjayne.com and a host of venues including Stitcher.com, Spreaker.com, TuneIn Radio, iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, SoundCloud, the iHeartRadio Network, and at our newest home on Google Play Music.
When you don't go to Geico.com, car insurance can seem intense. Like breakup R&B intense.
I thought you said you loved the sweater that I got you. If you didn't, you could have told me.
Geico makes it easy. Just go to Geico.com anytime to update or check your policy without all the extra drama.
I even had a gift receipt.
In the first thoroughly researched biography of actress Meryl Streep, Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep, with the narrative thrust of a novel, biographer Michael Schulman peels back the curtain behind the greatest actress of her generation, granting us an intimate look into the formative years that shaped Streep into the icon she is today. Schulman, a contributor and arts editor at The New Yorker, delivers a brilliant read, as dazzling as one of the performances of the iconic actress about which he writes. Let's talk. Michael, let me tell you before we get onto the subject of Her Again, Meryl Streep, that the first 9 pages of your book, as I told you off air, and listen to me, I love this so much I'm doing it on air, absolutely phenomenal. This book is worth every penny. It is so beautifully written. It's just
well, thank you.
Amazing. And I want to start our conversation with that applause. Not many biographies are as engaging as this one. So, question, has Meryl Streep read the book?
I don't know. You know, she didn't give me an interview for the book, but I sent her a copy through her publicist a couple weeks ago. I haven't heard anything, and I don't really expect to.
No?
I'm going to have to live with that.
Somewhere along the line, I have a feeling you're going to hear something. Listen, only someone who thoroughly admires this subject could write the book that you've written. And you got to tell me, were you in love with her before you started this? I mean, what got you here? Why Meryl?
So my route to Meryl it's a bit funny. So, of course, I have always admired her as an actress. Love her work. I love many of her movies. But a couple years ago, I got really interested in her acceptance speeches at award shows. You know, they're all so funny. She has this way now of kind of undercutting herself, which I write about in the book. You know, like she at the Emmys, she would say, "There are some days I'm overrated. I think I'm overrated, but not today." Or the way the book got its title, Her Again, is from the Academy Awards in 2012, when she said, "When they called my name, it was like I could hear half of America going, 'Her again.'" But whatever. And so I started memorizing these acceptance speeches. I thought they were so great, and that's kind of how my fixation started with her. But then, as I was contemplating the book, I started to think, well, first of all, there aren't a lot of great books out there about Meryl Streep, and she's, you know, one of the preeminent talents of our time. But what really made it click for me was deciding that it wouldn't be a kind of soup to nuts biography called, you know, Meryl Streep, An American Life. I really wanted to tell a story, and the story that I came up with was her origins, you know, her coming of age as a young woman in the 1970s. And so it really focuses on who she was in her 20s before she was famous, and asks the question, you know, what were the forces that shaped her, and how did she become this greatest living actress figure that she's been for, you know, the past 30 years.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's so fascinating, and that's the part that I think got me so engaged, because it really is such an insight into who this woman is. Wow. I mean, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, she didn't contribute to the project. Let's get that straight, correct?
That's right.
All right. But you did enormous amounts of research. I mean, you found people. Talk to me about that part of the project.
Oh, it was so much fun. It was like a huge scavenger hunt. I will say, I contacted her early on and just kind of let her know what I was up to and what I'm about, you know, and she did me the great favor of kind of not interfering. You know, she, as far as I know, she didn't tell anyone to stay away from me. She kind of just left me to my own devices. So I interviewed more than 80 people for the book, friends, classmates, teachers, directors, co-stars, a couple ex-boyfriends even, and that was so much fun. You know, I loved the scavenger hunt of it. But actually what I really loved even more than that was going to archives all over the country and digging in and finding old letters she had written to people that were now, you know, deep in some archive in Texas or Cleveland or wherever. You know, I really searched and found stuff that was just so great. And so for a kind of nerd like me, you know, researching, there's nothing more exciting than finding some, you know, yellowed old piece of paper somewhere that gives you a real insight into who she was at this particular time and place.
You brought it up, the nerd. Tell us about you. Who are you, Michael Schulman? Who's Michael?
Well, I grew up here in Manhattan, where I am right now, and I'm a big theater lover. I always have been, and I cover theater for the New Yorker magazine. So a big part of my interest in this part of Meryl's life was her theater career, which, you know, she hasn't done much on stage since really the early 80s when she got famous as a movie actress. So it just kind of combined a lot of my interests. Also, I went to Yale as an undergrad, and when I was there, I directed plays, and including a Christopher Durang play. And so I always knew about this legendary time in the Yale School of Drama in the 70s when Meryl and Sigourney Weaver and Chris Durang and Wendy Wasserstein were there all at the same time. And so I always wanted to explore that and sort of see that history as kind of like one of those Paris in the 20s moments where a lot of these people were, all these talents were converging at the same place in the same time. Sorry, I guess I'm talking about Meryl and more than me.
No, but we're getting an insight into you too. I mean, I think it is helpful to know how much of your background in some ways coincides with her, having been at Yale also, and understanding the dynamic of that particular school and what it has done for so much. Wendy Wasserstein, God bless her, right? May she rest in peace. I mean, so many people came out of that era, and you knew about it. Let's talk.
And also, it's a New York story, and as a New Yorker, I really could feel it sort of in a tactile way, you know, talking about Tribeca in the 1970s. And, you know, I grew up here in the 80s, and I kind of just remember that feeling of sort of dirty old New York City, which I love.
Well, I grew up in New Jersey, so I'm a Jersey girl, so I got that part of her story. But I have to tell you a little secret. Some people know this about me, my fans, but I opened the first theater in Tribeca. Ha-ha. How do you like that?
What? Oh, my gosh. What?
The Garris Theater.
Wow.
Me and Robert Pace and a bunch of... Do you remember who Michael Shurtleff was? He was before your time, but he was the casting director who actually found Dustin Hoffman and made him the star that he was.
Oh, gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so I have that whole background, too. So, when names come up like De Niro and all this, I'm like going, oh, my God, look what's happened since those days. Oh, my word. It's fascinating,
And it's a great era in New York theater because all
really
these talents were there. Meryl's friends there were, John Lithgow and Mandy Patinkin and Mary Beth Hurt, and Pacino was doing downtown theater. People were just around, and they were young, and they were doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
It was a great time in Manhattan, I have to tell you. It was a phenomenal time. I'm glad that I have those in my memories. Mary Louise Meryl Streep. Wow, right. Wow. All the women in her family were married.
Yeah.
I love that part. And that's kind of going to be something I want to talk to you about in a minute. But her story is that of a moth turned to a butterfly, the way that you tell it. It's like a metamorphosis. And let's start with that early life, the girl from suburban New Jersey, Bernardsville. Good parents, happy family life, nice brothers, good school talk.
Yeah, she had a very classic 1950s suburban sort of situation when she was growing up. Solidly middle class, backyard, 2 parents, 3 kids, nice public school that they all went to, and there was something, I didn't expect that. I think people sometimes wrongly assume that she's patrician, I think just because she looks that way.
Yeah.
But she was really, sort of a middle-class gal. And in terms of her metamorphosis, I found that so interesting. She was a little girl. She was sort of a bully, kind of a bossy tomboy almost. And she didn't really care about how she looked. She had these great cat eye glasses that made her look like a middle-aged secretary. And she didn't really care about how she appeared to others until she abruptly did when she entered high school and sort of went through adolescence and suddenly started fixating on appealing to boys. And the way she has recalled this time in her life is so fascinating because she says that basically she came up with this character that she decided to play. The first character she ever really played, which was that of a conformist, all-American, popular high school girl in the mid-'60s. So she studied women in magazines like 17 and Vogue and Glamour and Cosmo. And she dyed her hair and straightened her hair every night and joined the cheerleading squad and started dating handsome, football players on the football team. And basically, she just pursued with every ounce of her being this goal of being a kind of blandly pretty, popular cheerleader. And by the end of high school, she was elected homecoming queen by her peers, which was basically like being, winning best actress of her high school. She just pulled it off so well because even then she had an incredible talent for mimicry and for studying a character and then becoming it. Only her world was just so small, she didn't really know how to apply that gift except to try to be as middle of the road as she could.
But I find fascinating that somebody of that age would have that kind of thinking going on in their head and the power and control to contrive themselves that way. Didn't that amaze you?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we all do that in high school. We all not decide who we're going to be and then become that person, and we often feel like we're sort of faking a little bit or playing a role. I think what's different about her is that she was so innately talented at it that she could do it. And also, I think part of it was that she was so driven, partly by insecurity. She doesn't have conventional good looks. Of course, she's incredibly beautiful and has these striking features that helped make her a star, like her nose and her cheekbones. They're sort of like Betty Davis's eyes. They're slightly accentuated. But, at the time, she looked around at who the movie stars were of that era, like Audrey Hepburn or Anne Margaret or Jane Fonda, and they all have these perfectly symmetrical features. And I think she never thought she could be someone like a movie star. And it was her insecurity about her looks that really drove her throughout high school to pursue this character, this idea of who she wanted to be, until she was able to go to Vassar and kind of develop a more authentic sense of self.
I want to talk about her singing, too, because she did do that and actually studied with somebody rather famous. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so as a early adolescent, she was very interested in singing. She got up and performed in this Christmas chorale and shocked everyone because she had this gorgeous voice, this coloratura. And so her parents started her on lessons with a woman named Estelle Leaming in New York City, who was a renowned opera teacher. And she was later famous for being the teacher of Beverly Sills, the great opera star, whose lessons were right after Meryl. And she was this sort of old, kind of linked to old Europe. She had this incredible reputation. And young Meryl was studying with her, sort of dreaming of being an opera singer at the Philharmonic.
Let's talk Vassar. The one thing of her college years, and we could even say Yale, but what do you think she got the most out of that propelled her career forward, her drive forward, what she was going to become?
Her Vassar years I found so interesting. As I said, she had been living in this very small, kind of shallow high school suburban world. And then when she got to Vassar, first of all, it was an all-female school when she got there. And I think that had a really liberating effect on her. She didn't have to primp herself for boys all the time. She had a kind of intellectual awakening where she was suddenly reading James Joyce and, listening to music and not washing her hair for 2 weeks at a time. And she was able to really form deep friendships with other women, her classmates, whereas before they had all been, jockeying and competing for, the attentions of the football players at their high school. So I think it just really kind of relaxed her and allowed her to figure out who she really was. And part of that was acting. And in 1969, she was cast by her drama teacher at Vassar as Miss Julie in the Strindberg play Miss Julie, which is a very complicated, serious role. And all she had ever done was, play Marion the Librarian and other kind of High School Musical parts. And it was the first serious play she'd ever seen, much less been the star of, in a very sophisticated part. And I think emotionally it kind of just opened her up and completely stunned her how she was able to connect with this character who was a 19th century Swedish aristocrat, mistress of the house. I think that totally stunned her, but she wouldn't have gotten there if she hadn't had these experiences of being kind of intellectually opened up and really had not had this experience of transcending the kind of gender roles of suburbia.
So is that it? Is that the moment when she says, whoops, I know what I'm going to do?
Well, I don't think that she knew that she loved it, but she didn't yet know for sure that it was something she could pursue professionally. Actually, even through Yale Drama School, for much of her time in drama school, she was thinking, well, maybe I could be an environmental lawyer or something. She was. I think it took her a long time to be convinced that yes, this is what you can do for a living. But she did know that artistically, it clicked with her.
So let's go to Manhattan. Let's go to Joseph Papp. Talk to me.
Well, Joseph Papp, I'm not sure everyone knows this, is a legend, absolute legend in the theater world. He was the founder of the Public Theater and Shakespeare in the Park, and in the 70s in New York City, he was just the man. He was running like 3 different theaters. He had this whole empire, this downtown theater empire, and he plucked Meryl Streep from obscurity months after she left Yale Drama School and put her in a Broadway show and then gave her the lead in Shakespeare in the Park that summer. And she found a real mentor in him. It was a really, really important relationship that I explored a lot because I love Joseph Papp. I mean, he's just a complete, he's like one of these great New York personalities. And her first year in New York City was incredible. She was just in back-to-back Broadway shows. She got a Tony nomination. She was starring in Shakespeare in the Park. I mean, no one knew who she was, and yet she was suddenly everywhere. And it really established her for the New York theater audience right away.
And it's supposed to be harder than that, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
Right? You want to just kick her because it seemed so apparently easy. I want to talk about something before we go a little bit further in terms of her career, but I want to talk about her in this respect. She makes me think. I look at her, and I can't just watch her on screen. I have to think about her when I'm watching her on screen because she does something bubbles up out of that woman that doesn't bubble up out of a whole lot of actors, even actors who've had wonderful, terrific careers. She's somehow different. And here's what crossed my mind, and I wanted to hear what you had to say about it. It's sort of like, I don't know, there's a distance about her, a bridge, a wall between her and you, a secret maybe that she holds. There's something vague about her, but at the same time, something steely about her. I wondered if that's how you see her.
That's a great way of putting it. I think there is a kind of mystique about her. There's something that, we'll never quite get to the bottom of her, and that makes her characters very interesting. They make you want to lean in a little bit and pay attention. She never really puts over one simple emotion. There's always a little bit of another emotion, coloring it. Her sense of nuance about things runs so deep. I don't think she can ever do anything just the easy way. It's funny, one of the roles that she says that she was bad at was this movie it's a little known movie called Still of the Night from the early 80s. And she was cast in, it's a murder mystery, and she was cast as kind of a Hitchcock blonde femme fatale. And she's just not right for that, It should have been Faye Dunaway or something. She just doesn't, she's sort of allergic to these kind of female archetypes and really studiously avoided them throughout her movie career, I guess, except for this one time. And you can see why. She's not quite comfortable doing that. And I think it's because of that, she found this way of starring in these, really female-driven, complicated movies like Out of Africa and Sophie's Choice. She just can't stand to do anything that's not quite as complicated as those.
She's a character actor who's a star. That's what it is. I mean, and
she's a character actor trapped in a leading lady's body.
Exactly.
And she has the incredible beauty that allowed movie producers to make her the star of their movies. But inside, she feels like she can just be anyone. She can play an old lady or a Holocaust survivor or a sort of zombie Hollywood diva like in Death Becomes Her. I mean, she just has she has this shape-shifting soul, but it's in a package that kind of allowed her to become, a leading actress.
Let's go to this, because we think we know so much about her. We know nothing about her. You uncover so much. Talk to me about John Cazale. Is that how he was? Or Cazale?
John Cazale. I mean, he's incredible.
Tell us who he was first, for those who might not know. You just give his major role, and I think everybody will get the picture.
Well, so Fredo Corleone from The Godfather.
There you go.
That's how most people know him. He was an incredible character actor from that generation of Pacino and De Niro and all of them. And one great thing to know about him is that he was in 5 movies in his career. All of them were nominated for Best Picture, but none of them got him his own Oscar nomination. And, he was so peculiar. He has this extreme sort of look with this high, receding hairline and this sort of throbbing vein going down his forehead. He had this kind of childlike wonder about everything. I heard stories from his friends about how he would stay up all night tuning his color TV and stuff like that. So, and he was like that with characters. He had this nickname 20 Questions because he would just endlessly interrogate directors about his characters. So he was just such an unusual, sort of eccentric guy and a brilliant actor who always had this knack for playing kind of weaklings or Fredo is, no one comes out of The Godfather thinking, oh, wow, Fredo. He's sort of the guy who's always passed over, always looked over.
The loser.
The loser. He played sort of weakness and insecurity and petulance in his movies, and he was so good at it. But he was never the hero. He was never the De Niro character that people kind of latch onto.
I was going to say, and so talk to me about the relationship that he had.
Oh yeah. So,
that part.
So great actor who had already achieved this success in movies like The Godfather and Dog Day Afternoon, and he met Meryl in 1976 when they were cast in the Shakespeare in the Park production of Measure for Measure together. And they just had this intense, immediate, passionate connection and fell in love. They were just madly in love. It was what we would now call a showmance. The two stars of the play falling in love. And they moved in together in John's loft in Tribeca, sort of before it was commonly being called Tribeca. And it was such a strange relationship, you know. I mean, she's someone who's beautiful and always recognized as talented and gorgeous, and he's like this weirdo. I mean, I sort of think of him as like Adam Driver on Girls, you know. He's like kind of off,
yes,
but also weirdly sort of sexy. You know, their friends describe them to me as just like this couple where you couldn't help just look at them as they were walking down the street together. You know, such an odd pairing of people, but they had this incredible connection over acting. They were both people who took acting more seriously than anything. And very tragically, John Cazale was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer after they were together for only a year. And part of the reason why people don't know his name better is because he died at 42. And I really think if his career had gone on, he would be mentioned in the same breath as Pacino and De Niro. He's really that generation. But what happened was he got very sick very quickly. And Meryl, who was still quite young at that point, you know, 27, 28, she threw aside everything to care for him and really drew on all the strength she had to see him through and to try to get him better. You know, she was just there with him the whole time. However, even though she gave up a lot of work to be with him, this was the reason why she took her first major movie role,
right.
which was The Deer Hunter. And so he was around the same time he had just gotten diagnosed with lung cancer. Michael Cimino was casting The Deer Hunter with Robert De Niro, and they were scouting New York theater actors. And they had a role for John Cazale, and they had a role for Meryl Streep, who was, you know, kind of at that point known as John Cazale's girlfriend. And she wasn't very impressed with her part. She thought the role was kind of like an ingenue kind of token girl in a movie about men, which it is. And I think not something she would normally have pursued. But because this was a chance for her to be with John while he was getting sick, she took the part, and it wound up being her first Academy Award nomination.
Unbelievable story. A couple of things that I want to get to real quick before we finish, and that's let me ask you this: he dies, tragic. She's devastated, and yet, less than 6 months later, she marries the man who was still her husband, right?
Yeah, Don Gummer. This was one of the main reasons I wanted to explore this part of her life, is because, you know, this incredible, just the timeline of it. John Cazale died in March. She marries Don Gummer in September. It's 6 months where what is happening? What happens? It's almost like she was being pulled between these extreme emotions. It's like a Meryl Streep movie, you know? It was so dramatic. And in the middle of those 6 months, she started making Kramer versus Kramer and Manhattan and starring in Taming of the Shrew in Central Park. You know, so it was this incredibly fertile creative time for her, as well as being an unimaginably conflicted emotional time for her, where she was both in extreme grief and completely infatuated with this new guy.
Who she marries.
Yeah, still married to.
And still married to.
It must have seemed completely insane.
Any insight into to what happened and why she was able to, after going through something so traumatic, fall in love and that quickly again? I don't know if I could bounce back that quickly.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, it really tells you something about her.
Right.
I think part of it is that she found this avenue toward stability at a time when her life just seemed so horribly thrown off. You know, to have this great love and then lose it so quickly. She then found this man with whom she could have a family and a marriage, and she always wanted to have children. It was really important to her. I think she not only was she in love with him, but she sort of found this way to make her life kind of whole again. I also, you know, from what I could gather about her relationship with Don Gummer, it was really a sort of relationship of equals. They were both, you know, they were both talented at different things, which I think is a very healthy way to have a relationship.
Yeah, I don't know if we said that he's a sculptor.
He's a sculptor, yeah. And he worked with, you know, these, you know, materials like, you know, sheetrock and wood and steel, and he would make these things, and he was very good at looking at objects and geometry, and she, of course, is good at looking at people and behavior. So I kind of think that their marriage is about two people who are sort of insightful and brilliant at different things that kind of complement each other. It's very different from the Cazale relationship, which is two actors who, you know, have this intense focus on the same kind of art form.
Yeah, and I don't know, when I was reading the book, and then I was going looking at pictures, and I was thinking to myself, one is the love of a girl and one is the love of a woman. You know, and you can see, when you see her with him today, I mean, he is her rock. You can tell. She leans on him. She's going to the Academy Awards. I don't think it's something that makes her happy. That just doesn't seem like her style. 2 questions before we conclude. Of all you learned about her, number 1, what's the most surprising?
Surprising? Well, one of the things was how much she was shaped by second wave feminism. I didn't expect this to be a big part of the book at all, but it became absolutely crucial to it. You know, we know now she's very vocal. She sent a letter to every U.S. congressperson telling them to revive the Equal Rights Amendment. She gives speeches at the Women of the World Conference, stuff like that. But what I really uncovered that surprised and really pleased me, because it was interesting to explore, was how much she was a product of the age of Ms. Magazine and Gloria Steinem and consciousness-raising groups, and how important that was to what she saw for her career, and why she was so successful in the way she was. So I think giving her due as a young feminist of the 1970s was a surprise that I really welcomed. You know, one thing that I've discovered in life is that sometimes it's better to leave your icons where they are in your mind, you know, as we know them. And if you dig too deeply into anyone's life, I don't have to tell you, you're going to discover that even the biggest star is flawed in some way or another. That's my opinion. But what did you find most disappointing about Streep in this long journey into her life you led or had? That's a good question. Well, part of it was that even when she was first becoming famous, she complained a lot about celebrity. You know, every magazine profile I'd read of her from 1979, she would just complain. You know, why do I have to keep talking to these magazines? You know, why do I have to spend my private time with you, reporter? And I started getting kind of irritated with her for that. It's fair enough. I think she's now sort of hit this balance where she can deal with celebrity and all of its trappings. But as a 29-year-old, I found it a little bit insufferable how she would complain about being on the cover of magazines and things. You know, just embrace it. You know, it's happening. So yeah, I think I kind of dinged her for that in the book, because it strikes me as a tad just disingenuous. But I think that she's evolved, and she's never pursued fame for fame's sake. But I think at least now she's kind of learned to live with it and kind of poke fun at it in a way that she didn't then. Meryl Streep holds the record for the most Academy Award nominations of any actor, having been nominated 19 times since her first nomination in 1979 for her performance in The Deer Hunter. She has won 3 Academy Awards. She is the most nominated performer in Golden Globe Awards history. She has won 8. In total, Meryl Streep has amassed an amazing 409 nominations, 17 runner-ups, and 157 awards. For more about Meryl Streep, read Michael Schulman's Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep, by way of Harper, an imprint of HarperCollins. And be sure to visit Michael Schulman's website at michael-schulman.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Michael Schulman, author of Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep, and Barbara Leaming, author of Kick Kennedy, The Charmed Life and Tragic Death of the Favorite Kennedy Daughter. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
Record better audio anywhere with Motive digital microphones from Shure. Easy-to-use options like the MV88 plug directly into your phone or computer and include a free app. Create studio-quality sound for podcasts, music, and videos. Visit Shure.com to learn more.
Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. Share the link to the show with your friends or my show's player. And I would love it even more if you'd recommend they visit my website at hallicasserjayne.com. I look forward to seeing all of you there. In her new book, Kick Kennedy, The Charmed Life and Tragic Death of the Favorite Kennedy Daughter, author Barbara Leaming tells the story of Kathleen Kick Kennedy, second daughter of Joe and Rose Kennedy, the high-spirited and dynamic young woman, as ambitious and eager for power as her brother Jack, who would become the 35th President of the United States. Full of determination and with her best asset, her engaging personality, Kit Kennedy would defy her controlling parents and do the unthinkable, marry out of her faith Protestant Billy Hartington, eldest son and heir to the Duke of Devonshire. But as too many Kennedy stories go, Kit's triumph would turn into tragedy. But what a life she led in her brief sojourn on Earth. A tale that might have been lost forever, a story of love and war, of politics and changing expectations, socially and economically. Kit's story takes place at a pivotal point in history and can only be told by the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, including her most recent book, Jacqueline Bouvier, Kennedy Onassis, Barbara Leaming. Let's talk. Barbara, this really is some story, which I don't think a lot of people know, and yet this woman who lived such a brief life had a pivotal role in world history. Her name was Kit Kennedy. Give us a little background of who Kit was, and by the way, how did she get the name Kit?
Well, it's a very strange book for an author to write, because I've spent my whole life writing books about people that everybody knew immediately. This is who they are. But Kit Kennedy is somebody that you say, who? Who is it? The simplest answer is that she was President Kennedy's favorite sister. And the reason that we don't know very much about her is the fact that she died in a plane crash when she was just 28 years old. And as a result, she very much has been forgotten in history. But what was fascinating for me, and I started doing this book because I read a biography of President Kennedy a number of years ago, and I was hearing an enormous amount about Kit, obviously, all the way through that. And what one of the people said to me early on was, somebody who was a friend of both Jack's and Kit's, that Kit was Jack Kennedy's psychological twin. And I think what she meant by that, and what I certainly mean by it, is that they were tremendously alike in the sense that both of them were wildly ambitious. Both of them were desperately hungry for power and wanted to be people of influence. But both of them had the same problem, because in the Kennedy family, old Joe Kennedy taught the kids one big lesson, and that is that they were supposed to think of themselves as a unit. And that meant that they were supposed to think of themselves as Kennedys, not as individuals. Now, for Jack, who had an enormous ego, this turned out not to be such an enormous problem, because he satisfied his needs, his ego needs, by fighting to become the top Kennedy. And he did that because in the family, Joe Kennedy Jr., his older brother, was always the father's favorite, and the one that the father was saying was someday going to be president of the United States. And Jack was the sort of screwed up younger brother. He was probably not going to live long enough to be anything because he was so sickly. And yet, secretly, behind the scenes, Jack was absolutely convinced, as was Kit, she was his sole supporter, that Jack was really the smart one and the ambitious one and the one who could do it. And he did manage to completely oust the older brother before the older brother was killed in the war, and he was killed in the war. And it was an enormously unexpected thing in the family. And all of the later stories that we hear about Jack Kennedy never wanted to be president, and it was only because his brother died and he picked up the flag. I mean, that's all just garbage. It's not true. But Jack had solved his ego problem by this struggle. But for Kit, a girl in the Kennedy family was never going to be top Kennedy, no matter what she did. And she was certainly her father's favorite. I mean, no question. She was the favorite of everybody. But she couldn't find any way to get an identity in her own right. And so I think she understood fairly early she was going to have to find it someplace else. But how do you do that if you're in a family that's got this tremendous myth of themselves? She needed something that was equally overwhelming. And strangely enough, she found that in the most unlikely place, in the British aristocracy, because in 1938, Joe Kennedy was made the U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James in London, and the kids went with him, and Kit went with him. And at the age of 18, she did something very, very, very unexpected. She saw her opening to be a star in a world you would never expect to find a Kennedy in. So the result is, I mean, this story that I've written is not a typical Kennedy story at all. all. Instead, what it is Kick's story takes us into a whole other world, that of the most closed part of the British aristocracy, what I call the aristocratic cousinhood. And it takes us into that world at a moment of tumultuous change, when that world is in the process of losing its political power forever. And it's an enormously important moment in history. And so strangely enough, this little girl, this 18-year-old girl, takes us in and gives us a way to write a really, really big piece of history. If you're looking for Hyannisport, you aren't going to find it.
No, but you find something so much more delicious in one sense because we don't know it.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's a world that's normally so closed. I mean, the world of the aristocratic cousinhood that Kick enters is a world in which cousins marry cousins for centuries, for generations. And as a result, outsiders don't get in. They don't know what's going on. And of course, I had this very, very strange thing happened to me because I started out not knowing anybody here. I went to England to research President Kennedy's connection to England, and over the course of more than 15 years, I spent inside this world, both the world of the Kennedys as it connects to this, but also in the world of the British aristocracy, because these people see themselves as trustees of history. So if you get in, they want you to do it right. And it was an extraordinary adventure doing it, because the key players in Kick's story, most of them were still alive when I began the book. They're all gone now, but they were still alive. And I had the opportunity over the course of writing both the biography of President Kennedy and then a book about Winston Churchill, of getting to know these people and their world and talking to them in very, very, very intimate ways about what was going on in Kick's life and their life in these years. So it was a very strange experience, both for me and certainly, I'm sure, much stranger for Kick.
I can imagine. Okay, 2 questions real quickly. How did you get the name Kick?
The name Kick is one of the mysteries. There are 27 different stories. The one that I think probably is closest, but it may not be right, is one that one of their friends told me very early on, which was that it had just to do with the fact that she was so alive and she had so much vitality, and that's, of course, what all the English people said about her, and that this name got attached to her. Somebody else said it might be something that, that when the kids were little, they couldn't pronounce her name Kathleen, and it somehow became Kick. Somebody else told me it had to do with her kicking like a horse. I think it basically is just that once you've heard people talk about her, it's her life force that you think about, and somehow the name Kick really, really works for that.
Absolutely. And another thing about her that I thought was so interesting, I mean, you describe her not as a pretty girl, because she's not. She certainly doesn't. She didn't get the looks that the brothers got, that's for sure. But she certainly made up in that with spirit, and she did that whole world by storm. I mean, they just embraced, and they gave her a little test to begin with. And you guys need to read the book, a very funny little story in the book about how she wended her way through it all and got in, even though they tested her. But what a personality. I want to go into Rose, because Rose surprises me in this book. Now, I'm of a generation that I kind of remember her. By the time I remember her, she's already old and kind of in her doterage. But she's a tough mama. Talk to me.
Yeah. Rose and Kick's relationship is one of the saddest. This is an 8-handkerchief story. I mean,
it is.
Poor Kick. I mean, she has everything and loses everything. But her relationship with her mother, I think, was something that I really tried very, very hard to understand, because Rose Kennedy obviously did not have an easy life by any stretch of the imagination. And what was interesting to me was when I began to understand that in their family life, Kick had always been her mother's protector. She was religious like her mother. She'd been sent to convent schools and stuff. But the reason she was her mother's protector was that the father was the worst womanizer he makes Jack look like nothing. And not only was he a womanizer, but the women were paraded in front of poor Rose. And before Kick went to England, one of their friends told me a story which I think maybe explains exactly how important Kick was to Rose. They were having lunch one afternoon at Hyannis, and all the kids were sitting at the table, and Rose was there. And Joe arrived with his mistress of the moment and sat her down at the table with his wife and the kids. And the boys, of course, did nothing. They just sat there like, well, what's wrong with that? Isn't that nice, Daddy? It was Kick, who was then just a very young teenager, stood up and said, effectively, Dottie, you cannot do this to Mommy. You can't. This woman can't be here with Mommy. And not only did she dare to do that with Joe, who was a tough guy, but he took it from her. And that was the kind of thing she always did. She protected her mother when Jack and Joe would laugh at the mother, because the mother was treated like a clown by the boys in the family. And she was a very, very sad person. I mean, I came to feel eventually that for Rose, her religion, I mean, sure, of course she believed it, but it was the thing that kept her alive. It was the thing that protected her against Joe, against the position that she had in the world. It allowed her to deny the horrors that really made up her life. And so when Kik went to England and became, as you said, the absolute star of this group, not because she was a beautiful girl, but because she was unlike any of the other girls in this world. I mean, those girls, when she arrived in 1938, and I was talking to the girls, and they weren't girls then, they were in their 80s, but I remember them saying to me, you can imagine how boring we were, because we'd been either up in Scotland or in the country someplace in the family castle, and we hadn't been around any boys except our brothers. And when suddenly, at the age of 18, we were being brought down to London, which they all were, in the spring, to what was effectively a marriage market. They were being brought down with chaperones, with their mothers watching them like hawks, completely unused to any kind of social life, and expected to find a husband fast and find a suitable husband among their cousins. And the boys were very different, because the boys were all interested in ideas, but even I think more than that, in 1938, those boys, as Andrew Devonshire, the Duke of Devonshire, he and his wife Debo, who effectively inherited the life Kik would have had. And some of your listeners may know Debo Devonshire better as the last of the famous Mitford sisters. She and Andrew, who became the Duke, were, I mean, I couldn't have done the book without them. And they, both said to me, Andrew particularly, Andrew said, the boys in this period, like Andrew himself, expected to die. They did not agree with their parents who said, well, war is going to be avoided at all costs. They thought it was coming. They knew Hitler was coming, and they did not expect to live through that. And so the boys were, first of all, tremendously involved in every bit of politics that was going on, but they were also wild. They were incredibly wild, and they were always in terrible car crashes because they had lots of money and these incredible sports cars that they drive back and forth between London and a party in Cambridge or Oxford where they were going to school. They were drinking so much champagne, they couldn't see straight. And into that world came these innocent little girls who didn't want to hear anything about any of this, who only wanted to talk, if they wanted to talk at all, about the dresses that they were going to wear. And Kik walked in, and she had been Jack's mascot in America. And as it happened, what Jack was interested in was exactly the same things that these boys were interested in. He was completely absorbed in British history and culture and politics. And he had talked about it in front of his younger sister. And she had listened, and she was interested. And so when she arrived in England, and the boys are standing there talking politics, and they expect Kik to walk off with their cousins. No, she doesn't. She stays, and she takes part, even if she makes an idiot of herself. She doesn't care. She's completely relaxed with them. She can laugh at herself, but most of all, she likes talking about the same things that they're doing, and that was just enormously appealing for her. But also, as you said, there's another very big trick about it, because she's no beauty, but part of the thing, you do ask yourself, with these people, why do they want the granddaughter of a Boston saloon keeper? I mean, that's a little odd. It's not what you think if somebody's going to inherit a palace. It's not what you think you're going to put in there. But I think it's exactly what they wanted, because particularly the two families, the two great Protestant families that Kik got involved with, the Cavendishes and the Cecils, they had particularly the Cecils, I guess, they had a tradition of when they intermarried for too long and the bloodline started to weaken, they would marry outside something that would give them literally red blood for their blue blood and renew the line. And when they saw Kik and they saw how aggressive she was and how competitive she was and how unstoppable she was, they recognized, this is the red blood we need. And as it happened, nicely enough, Kik had fallen in love with the most eligible bachelor in England at that point, a boy called Billy Hardington, who was the heir to the Duke of Devonshire and who was simply the most eligible bachelor in Britain. He had at one point been thought of as possible as a husband for the woman who became Queen Elizabeth, for Princess Elizabeth. And Billy fell madly in love with Kik, but you then have the Protestant Catholic thing, which brings us back to Rose, because this is going to break Rose's heart. If her daughter, it'll be wonderful if her daughter becomes a duchess, but not a Protestant duchess. So what is she going to do? And Billy's family is equally hysterical. And so then you have this terrible, terrible struggle to see how they can possibly marry. And they do eventually. After 6 years, they marry. But it's against all odds. But I think when you realize how hard Kik fought, and it's really Kik who's fighting to get to Billy, when you realize it, I think there's one thing, when I think about it, that I think, well, I understand it completely. Imagine being an 18-year-old girl who has the most attractive boy in London, the richest boy in London, madly in love with her, and he takes her to see where they're going to live together at the age of 18, their main house, and that is Chatsworth, which is the palace of the Devonshire Dukes. It's the main house of theirs. And an 18-year-old girl coming over the bridge and a little river in front of this golden palace couldn't possibly believe she was living in real life. The windows of Chatsworth are framed in 18-karat gold. And so when you come over this beautiful little stone bridge over the river and the sun catches the light on the window frames, the palace literally glitters in the sun. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your life. And I remember the first time that I went there, I said to myself, what must this have been like at 18 to come here in love for the first time in your life with somebody who's in love with you, and he says, you're going to be my duchess and we're going to do wonderful things together. You fight for that. And she did fight for it, and she eventually got him, but at the cost of breaking her mother's heart.
Talked about her father in all of this, because she really was her father's daughter.
Yes, she was. I mean, in terms of, yes, that's really perceptive, because she had all that drive that Joe had, but she had a kind of sweetness that I think he was utterly lacking. But he was very important for her, because Kik had lived her whole life and continued to live it, believing that Daddy could fix anything, that anything she wanted, Daddy would fix for her. And when Billy Hardington said to Kik in 1944, after they'd been in love for 6 years and she'd finally gotten back to him, and he said to her, Kik, you have to understand that if we are going to marry, it's you who has to compromise your religion. I can't do it. The children that we have to be raised as Anglican, and I want you to remain, a Catholic for yourself, but your children cannot be. And this was obviously in those days, this was not acceptable to the Catholic Church. And the reason Billy said this was, at that point, they had 8 different estates, I think it was. So, it covers thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. And one of the duties of the Duke of Devonshire was to appoint the vicar, the minister in each of the parishes in the various estates. And as Billy said to Kik, what am I going to do with my children if they're little Roman Catholics and they're going to be appointing the Anglican vicar? I mean, that you just can't do that. It doesn't work. We can't do it. And I think that Kik understood that. And I think that Kik eventually found a way to morally take in and accept what Billy was asking her to do without feeling that she was doing wrong. Because I think by that time, the code of honor and duty that was so intrinsic to Billy Hardington was a very good person. I mean, when you mean good, you think of Billy. He was really a good person. And I think that his code of honor and duty had come to be a kind of substitute for Kik to the values that she had found in religion, but they were not enough for her mother. And so when she said that she was going to marry Billy, her mother went wild and did everything she could to stop it. But Kik eventually went ahead with it. But 4 months after she had married Billy, Billy was killed at the front in Belgium, and everything that she had sacrificed for him seemed to be gone, including the relationship with her mother. Even though her mother was saying she accepted it, was not healed. Kik was home. She had flown home to the United States in August of 44 because her brother Joe had been killed, and she went thinking, I have to comfort my parents. And when she was there, word came that her husband had been killed, and she felt very very strongly that her mother saw that as God's retribution for having married this boy, and Kik couldn't handle that, and Kik got on a plane and went back to Billy's family in England and to her friends, because I think by then Billy's family had really, and particularly Billy's mother, had become the kind of mother that everybody dreams of having, and there she could mourn, but then she was left with the thing, I'm a girl, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What happens? Where do I belong? And that's a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous question. You know, what do you do? And her relationship with her mother is tortured from then on.
Right. Now hear me. Tragedy in this family. Right? And, you know, whenever we talk about it in terms of the boys. You know, they lost Joe. They lost everybody, really, right? Okay, here's the bottom line. But she is her father's daughter. Who is the next person she gets involved with? A gambler?
Well, that's the problem, and it is too close to the father in this particular case.
And we only have a few minutes.
In 1945, when the war was over, the British aristocracy, it's like, I think maybe the easiest way to think about it is it's the last chapter of Downton Abbey, except it's real. I mean, the loss of aristocratic power that had begun in the First World War finishes off in 45, and Winston Churchill is thrown from office, and the society in England changes forever. People are not coming back to be servants in the great houses. It's different. It's just not going to happen. But for Kik, it wasn't just that she had lost the boy that she dreamt of, but she had lost this possibility of being a powerful person, and she wanted that. And what happened within 2 years was she met somebody who she thought could, no matter what had happened in society, give her what she had thought she'd have with Billy, a man called Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. Peter Fitzwilliam was richer than Billy. He had a much bigger house than Billy had. He was also, unfortunately, married. He was a drunk. He was a womanizer, and he was the worst person that Kik could possibly have gotten involved with, and she thought he was the most wonderful man in the world. And no matter how many of her friends went to her and said, Kik, you don't understand who Peter is. We may like him. He's tremendously appealing, but this is not for you. She kept saying the same thing over and over. Oh, you don't know Peter like I know Peter. And as all of the friends said to me afterwards, you know, this was going very bad places, not only because Peter was not the person you picked for a husband, but in addition to that, I think, and this is where we get back to the religion and to Rose, even though when she finally told Rose, and it was very hard for her, Rose threatened her and said, you know, if you go through with this marriage, you will not only never see me again, you will never see any of your siblings. The family is gone to you. And I don't know whether she could have enforced that or not, but it made Kik hysterical. But I think in addition to that, what Billy's sister Elizabeth told me, and I think that Elizabeth adored Kik and actually went with Kik to America to give her moral support, to tell her parents that she was going to marry Fitzwilliam, even though Elizabeth thought it was a disastrous idea. She would do anything for her sister-in-law. And Elizabeth said to me, you know, you have to understand that when Kik married Billy, she did not think she was doing anything wrong in terms of her religion. She believed that it was right and that it was good. With Fitzwilliam, she was suddenly put in the position of that woman at the table in Hyannisport. She was sitting there as the mistress in front of this man's wife. She was doing the one thing that she couldn't reconcile with her own Catholic beliefs, which was getting herself involved with a married man. And as Elizabeth said to me, I think it was all going to be much too much for Kik. It was just not something she could have handled. And I think in a sense that's right. And I think that's part of the reason for her desperation at the end of her life, because the last thing that she did was to go off in a plane with Peter Fitzwilliam to ask her father to put a fix in with the Vatican, to somehow find a way that they could marry and that it would be morally okay with the church. But before they met with the father, they were going off for a weekend together. And they stopped over in Paris very briefly, went and had lunch. And by the time they came back to the airport, and Peter had a private plane for the trip, and the pilot said, we can't take off. There's a terrible storm coming. And Peter Fitzwilliam, who was a commando during the war and who had hubris up the gazoo, said, we will take off. We're going anyway. We're get in the plane and fly us. And the pilot said, I'm not going to do it. And Peter said, we are going to do it. And they went and they took off and they crashed into the side of a mountain. And both of them, both he and Kik, were killed instantly. And Joe,
the father, had to be the one to identify the body. Oh, my God. I mean, the tragedy goes on. It's relentless. One question I must ask you, and that is, how did Rose reconcile all of this, having lost his daughter?
The strangest thing, I can tell you the answer to that. It's a very, very strange answer. Rose never reconciled it with Kik in her life. She did not come to the funeral. She did not bury her daughter. Billy's mother buried her daughter. Joe came to the thing, but Rose did not. But not only did Billy's mother bury Kik, but she buried her in a Catholic ceremony. This is the great Protestant family in England, and she did whatever was right for Kik and also to make things easier for Rose, she thought. And Kik is buried now in a little village graveyard overlooking Chatsworth. What happened with Rose, though, was that Billy's mother, Malsher, which was her nickname, Malsher reached out to Rose and somehow or other established a friendship with her that endured for the rest of Rose's life. And I remember Andrew saying to me that when Bobby Kennedy was killed, his mother said, Andrew, get in the plane and go to Rose. And Andrew flew over to America, was on the train with Rose and sat there with Rose in the car as the train was taking Bobby's body, giving the family's respects. It was Malsher who somehow made it possible for Rose to, I think, sadly enough, almost pretend that it hadn't happened or to reconcile herself in some way to it. Andrew believed that she was reconciled through her religion, and I think maybe, he would know better than I would, but certainly their mother was the one who was responsible for making it as easy as possible for Rose, who had done something, that couldn't be changed then. Your heart breaks for her, too. It's somebody trapped in a horrible situation.
Absolutely. I want to, we only have like 30 seconds, maybe a minute I can squeeze in here, but I want to ask you this because I think we really do have to talk about this. This story is unbelievably compelling, and I tell everybody read it because, oh my gosh, it's better than Downton Abbey. But above and beyond that story, what she leaves as a legacy, this young woman who died at 28 in a plane crash, another plane crash, Kennedy family, is the influence she actually had on Jack. She opened doors for him that later would make it possible for him to do so much of his foreign policy. I just want you to report on that.
Yeah, that's correct, and that is her legacy, and it's extraordinary. What Jack Kennedy believed to be the greatest achievement of his presidency was the agreement that he made in the summer of 1963 with the Soviets for a limited test ban treaty, nuclear test ban treaty, and that was what Jack thought was the achievement of his presidency. And he said himself, and it is absolutely true, that without Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and the ambassador to the U.S. from Britain, David Ormsby Gore, this would never have happened. David Ormsby Gore and Harold Macmillan would never have had that relationship with Jack if it were not for Kik. They were her legacy because Harold Macmillan was Billy's uncle and David Ormsby Gore was Billy's cousin and had been raised as his brother. And it was Kik who passed on that family relationship of the Devonshires, which is the ducal family, to Jack Kennedy and changed his presidency in ways that are absolutely essential to understanding the man who Jack wanted to be. Kik made it possible, I think, in death for Jack to have that tremendous moment of being the man he wanted to be in the last weeks, literally, of his life. It's an astonishing legacy.
I've been speaking with Barbara Leaming, the author of Kik Kennedy, The Charmed Life and Tragic Death of the Favorite Kennedy Daughter, by way of Thomas Dunn Books. For more information on the book, visit www.usmacmillan.com, Kik Kennedy, Barbara Leaming. And on Facebook, the author's page is barbara.leaming1.
Record better audio anywhere with Motive digital microphones from Shure. Easy-to-use options like the MV88 plug directly into your phone or computer and include a free app. Create studio-quality sound for podcasts, music, and videos. Visit Shure.com to learn more.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. Associate producer, Suzanne Probst. Music by Tony Rosales Jazz. Visit HalliCasserJayne.com.